Chapter 25, The Great Depression and the New Deal. This is just basically a review of some of the things I told you last time, just in a different way it's worded. But the stock market crash in 29 was caused by a weakness in the economy, a very unequal distribution of the wealth, agricultural suffering from overproduction and declining prices because we had so much production, and of course the farmers are in heavy debt. The mining industries are much the same. They're overproduced. Poorly managed banks. Europeans, because of our high tariffs, stopped trading with us very much. And then because of the depression hitting in Europe, they defaulted on their loans. And our government policies, they reduced the taxes on the wealthy and were encouraging speculations. There was no regulation, so it was all there like a big, nice, ripe balloon ready to pop. And of course, once it happened, the businesses are losing confidence in the government. 25% of the workers are unemployed, and you're talking millions. Farm prices fell the first year 55%, and people are losing their homes, are being repossessed. And the farmers who are working on the land they can't keep up. And those that are dispossessed, well, they just roam around. Some move in with their relatives, or they build shacks, and they call these shacks, and they have whole villages of shacks. They call them Hoovervilles because the president's name was Hoover. And there were soup kitchens and bread lines in all your major cities. And even though we had no federal support or really state support, it was usually the church charities or individuals who helped. And it didn't take very long for them to use up everything they had stockpiled. And women, oh, bless their hearts. You know, women worked in low-paying jobs. So, of course, we're going to be one of the last ones to be fired because we're working so cheap. But the great thing about a woman is she doesn't have any pride when it comes to working and making a living to feed the children. We'll scrub a toilet. We'll scrub a floor. We'll do anything to provide money to feed the children. Whereas sometimes the men are too proud to do this. And I'm not trying to be sexist. It's just the way it is. Of course, married women were fired because it was the society at the time that the man should be the breadwinner. But unfortunately, in some families, many families, the women were the ones who were providing the only financial support. Divorce rate falls. Who can afford to get a divorce? If you're planning to get married, you're going to postpone it because you can afford a wedding. And the children, it was so sad because everybody was so fearful, not knowing what's happening, what's going to happen next. And the birth rate falls because you're just too tired to do any hanky-panky. And the husbands and fathers are so ashamed because society, as I said, was that the man should be the support of the family. And if you haven't got a job, and it's not because you're not qualified, it's because there's just no job available. And so many families, they had to go without food. Of course, any future education or any future plans that you had to be postponed. And sometimes boys and girls had to stay home from school because they didn't even have any shoes to wear to school, and they didn't have any money to buy any lunch. And they were dying of malnutrition and starvation in the big cities. The whole country was feeling fear. There was no hope. There was no security. There was no future. And this couldn't be happening in America. The minorities were hurt the worst. Black unemployment rate was twice that of the white man, and the Mexican migrant workers, they were so afraid they were going to be arrested or deported. And because of the racism in our country, because we were very racist at this time, any assistance that was available, it went to the white person. And if you did get any, if you were black, it was always less than half the white man got. The white charities and any state government or county agency, they didn't even offer help to the minorities. And of course, they had to live somewhere. So sometimes they have 3 and 4 and 5 families living in a one-room place just to have some place to live. And of course, we were encouraging all the migrant workers and all the immigrants to go back home. And there was protests too, but most people didn't protest. But there were some organizations and some groups of people who just got so fed up they had to protest. And I think your text gives you 2 examples, like in Pleasantville, New Jersey. They held the town hostage while they were trying to make some arrangements for food. In Louisiana, they seized a train. But the Communist Party and the Socialists, they led a lot of protests and made promises, and sometimes they'd come through. But, you know, when you're hungry and you have no hope and no prospects, you'll listen to anyone who promises you're going to make things better. And it wasn't just in the big cities. There were protests in the farm areas too. In Iowa, they beat up a sheriff and nearly lynched a judge. In Nebraska, they threatened to tear down the state capitol building if the government didn't do something. And all they were wanting was like bread, like in the French Revolution, give them bread. They didn't even have bread to eat, and they wanted a job. This is a large crowd of Mexican Americans waiting to leave Los Angeles in 32 because they're going to try to, they've either been asked to leave or they're going home voluntarily because there's no work here. President Hoover, of course, was the president at the time, and he wasn't a bad guy. He just was the wrong guy at the wrong time. And this is an example of what they called Hoovervilles. And you can see their shacks made out of tin and cardboard. And in the background, you see the big cities, but maybe they lived there at one time, but they can't now because they have no money, no jobs, nothing. But Hoover believed in private help. He didn't think government assistance should be encouraged because all you're going to do is to, well, it's going to undermine the individual and expand big government. So he advises and he encourages the local communities and individuals to help out the poor and unemployed. And like I said, all the private agencies, their resources were very quickly exhausted. And then he persuaded Congress to cut taxes. And he lent money to big cooperatives. The only good thing we can say he did was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which lent funds to banks and insurance companies and railroads in the hopes of maybe stimulating the economy. But the public saw him as uncaring. They thought he was jawboning. He was just yak, 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 yak all the time, and he wasn't doing anything. And of course, the political opponents are encouraging this feeling. But the veterans of World War I had been promised this big bonus, and especially for the veterans. And it was going to be paid in 10 years. And, that's fine. It was dandy. But this was in the 1920s. And they were prosperous. But when the Great Depression hit, well, their attitude kind of changed because they're out of work, they're destitute, and they got families to feed. So the veterans organized a march on Washington in May of 1932. And we're going to try to force Congress to pay them their bonuses now. Don't wait till 1945. And there's been estimates of about 15,000 made their way to the nation's capital. And they call themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force. And anything they could find, any scrap of wood or iron or any loose material, they'd set up a ramshackle camp throughout the city wherever they could find a space. And they said in one area they had as many as 10,000. And they waited in vain. Congress was going to act. And on June 17th, the Senate voted against the House-passed bill that would have paid them their bonus immediately. They had no place to go. They were hungry. They had no food. And a lot of private individuals did come up with food to feed them. But the majority of the bonus army remained encamped in the city, despite the fact that Congress had adjourned. They were gone for the summer. And finally, President Hoover decides it's not looking good. So he orders the army to forcefully remove the veterans. And on July the 28th, a force of tanks and cavalry under the command of the soon-to-be famous General Douglas MacArthur stormed the camps and drove the veterans out and set their makeshift camps on fire. They tried to blame the communists. They said they were communist-inspired, but nobody was buying that. And all this was caught on film. So the whole country saw what the military was doing to our veterans. And it's a presidential election year. Now, this is some pictures that were actually taken. On the left, of course, you can see they're wearing the gas masks because they're using tear gas on these men. And on the right, of course, you've got the cavalry surrounding them. And they had pictures of people getting hurt, and it just was not a good thing. February 1933, 6,000 banks failed. 9 million depositors lost all their money. Now, at this point in time, it didn't matter. You could have a good business. You could be making money every month and putting it in the bank. And if the bank is only allowed to operate on the money it has available. So if the bank closes, any money that you had in there is gone. Hoover did nothing. He was a lame duck president because we had a new president elected. So the states began closing the banks to prevent more runs because, as you can see in the picture, everybody's trying to get some of their money out of the bank before it closes because if you've got it in there and the bank closes, you're just out of luck. FDR had been elected in 1932. Now, FDR is a strange duck. It seems strange that in a country that in the midst of a depression and everybody's broken, we elect this man who's really rich and been raised in very much privilege on a New York country estate. And like so many people at the time, laissez-faire, they believe that they should help pay back when they're this well off, much like Bill Gates gives to charities now. Uh, he decided the way to help and contribute was to go into politics. He was a distant cousin of Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, not Franklin, he's Franklin. Teddy. Tongue got twisted there, I'm sorry. And Teddy had helped raise one of his relatives' children, whose name was Eleanor Roosevelt. And they met after she came back from her coming out and going to Europe, and they got married. And Eleanor was a very quiet young woman. She was kind of attractive when she was young, but very quiet. And she just fell head over heels for Franklin because he was a tall, good-looking man. They got married, and political reasons, even though they were cousins, they weren't that close. And in 1920, he contracted polio. He lost the use of his legs, but in the days before television and public inquiry, which we didn't have to know this much about our politicians until Nixon comes along, it was private. The newspaper reporters knew about it. The staff at the White House knew about it, but the general public didn't know. They had no idea that the president was confined to a wheelchair. We'd see him standing real close to his friends, We thought, how nice, he's got those buddies helping him. Or we'd be in the car driving around. His wife was the one that went out and did a lot of the campaigning. She was his legs. With the 1932 elections, he promised a New Deal and a repeal of prohibition, which popular support immediately. He won overwhelmingly. And the Democrats even gained control of the Congress because it's our way of doing things. If we don't like the way things are going now and we've got one party in, we're going to vote him out and try the other party. Now, he was a former governor of New York, and he'd been very pragmatic. He had nothing against trying new ideas, and he'd done a real good job when he was governor of New York. Now, this is just a map. As you can see, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 states that voted Republican and for Hoover. And the rest of them, all the green, straight for the Democrats. What's so surprising is Pennsylvania, just right below his home state, didn't go for him. They're very conservative. He gave the nation confidence, and of course his famous quote is, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." And he promised a new deal for everyone. And he wanted to keep the people informed, so he had what they call fireside chats. Now, in our innocence, we all thought that he was sitting in a big old easy chair in front of a fireplace and talking to us, my fellow Americans. And we had visions of, Mrs. Roosevelt's in the kitchen making some cookies. And he tells us stories about his little dog. He had a little Scottish terrier named Fella. And sometimes he'd tell us about, Fella chewed up my house slipper, or he did something to Mrs. Roosevelt. And it was just, we felt like we were part of it. I mean, he was talking to us on the radio, which was still kind of new. And we've got pictures of people sitting and staring at the radio. And he'd make us laugh because of his funny stories. He'd make us cry when he'd tell us about something bad that was happening overseas. He'd keep us informed. And I have a little YouTube. It's just a little over a minute of one of his fireside chats. Only it's not a fireside chat. As you can see, he's got microphones in front of him, and this is the way it was. But not in our mind. In our mind, he was sitting in front of the fire in a big easy chair talking to me. One of the first things he did when he got elected was the National Industrial Recovery Act. And he appointed a man named Hugh Johnson to be the director. But it didn't work because he wanted the employers to help and to make things easier, but all they were doing was using the government to further their own interest and to try to get rid of the unions. And they started having strikes, and then the employers would use strike breakers and everything they could to get rid of the unions, because nobody that owned a business liked the unions. But Mr. Johnson was pro-business, and he's telling everybody the strikes are wrong. Now, part of this National Industrial Recovery Act was the government had given the unions the right to organize and to collectively bargain, but it's not being enforced. So the unions are getting short shift. And there's critics too, right and left, because this is the first New Deal we're talking about. And in the beginning of the New Deal, of course it didn't end the Depression, but it gave people hope because we had a feeling that somebody was doing something. But some people said, and of course this is in Washington, it's too little too late. Some said, we've already spent too much, it's costed too much. And then there was a big complaint, too, about, he promised to help the people at the bottom of the social ladder, but he seems to have forgotten them. And of course, the communists and the socialists, they're organizing workers for strikes and for demonstrations. And here again, the employees keep using excessive violence to end the strikes in any type of organization. And there's 4 very prominent leaders discussed in your text, and we'll take a quick look at them. Representative William Linke of North Dakota. And what he did was right. He called attention to the people in distress in the rural communities, because we're talking about the people in the cities with the bread lines and everything, but what about these people out on the farms? He said nearly 2/3 of the farmers in North Dakota had lost their farms through being repossessed because they couldn't make the bills. Now, Francis Townsend was a California physician, and he had an idea. He said, what we need to do is to have a pension plan, give everybody over 60 some money, and make jobs for the unemployed. Well, it sounded pretty good. It's going to be similar to the Social Security plan that comes out later. Now, Father Charles Coogan, now I have not had the benefit of hearing him. They've got some tapes of him speaking. They say he could charm a bird out of a tree, that once you listened to him, you just could not you had to hear him again. And he broadcasted from Detroit weekly, and millions listened to him. And in the beginning, he welcomed the New Deal, but then he began to condemn it because he said it's favoring business and big finance. And in the long run, he wound up being a spokesman for the Hitler Youth Group. And Senator Huey Long of Louisiana. Oh, he is a character and a half. He came up with a plan called Share Our Wealth. Oh, it was a good plan. He was going to have excessive taxes and penalties on the very, very rich, enough to give everybody in the country $2,000 a year and put them to work. Now, the poor people, of course, love this. You're going to give them health coverage. You're going to give them $2,000 a year. You're going to get old age pension. Wow, this is a great plan. Now, we didn't have all that many wealthy, but it's the wealthy who's got the power, and they didn't like this plan for sour apples. So each one of them, they started out in favor of it, but they decided it either wasn't enough, you need to do more, and of course, it's like some people say, you need more money, just print some more money. Well, it's not that easy. If you don't have people working and paying taxes and things coming in, you can't have anything coming out. Now, Huey Long was called a kingfish. And I don't know if you can read it or not, but it says Share Our Wealth underneath his picture. He was very, very popular. He's one of the first men to actually buy radio time to broadcast. The networks used to donate free time for politicians, but he bought it. He sometimes talked all night long down there in Louisiana. He was very well loved and very well hated. There wasn't any middle ground for him. But he's called the kingfish. And the kingfish is, I don't understand why, because the kingfish was an African-American on a radio show back in the 20s and 30s. As a matter of fact, if you go on and type Amos and Andy radio show on, and come up with YouTube, you would see, you get to hear one of their shows. It's quite funny and very racist. But something called dust storms. Oh man, that's not good. Right after World War I, or during World War I, the demand for wheat had just been humongous. And farmers were paid record prices for their crops. And so to the farmer, it makes sense to turn every inch of the plains into something to grow. And during the war, the land produced millions and millions of bushels of wheat and corn, which helped to feed we in America, as well as a lot of nations overseas. But the farming practices that made the plains so productive were, well, they're starting to take a toll on the land. The grasslands out there in the plains had been deeply plowed and planted for years. And during the years when there was adequate rainfall, well, the land produced bountiful crops. But in the late 1930s, the drought started. And it persisted. But the farmers kept plowing and planting, and of course the results were dismal. But in 1930 and early 31, the Oklahoma and Texas panhandles were known as the most prosperous region in the nation. For Plains farmers, the decade opened with prosperity and growth. But in the summer of 1931, those farmers saw their dreams go down in flames. You know, it had taken 1,000 years for nature to build an inch of topsoil on the southern plains. But it only takes a couple of minutes for one good blow to sweep it all away. And the water levels of lakes dropped by 5 feet or more, and the wind picked up the dry soil. It had nothing to hold it down. No rain. The wind, great black dust clouds began to blow, and it was so thick they blotted out the sun. In some places, the dust drifted like snow, darkening the sky for days, and covering even well-sealed homes with a thick layer of dust on everything. Dust storms sometimes engulfed entire towns. But the primary impact of the area of the Dust Bowl, which is what it came to be known as, was on the southern plains. The northern plains weren't so badly affected, but the drought, the dust, caused agriculture to decline, and, well, it was felt everywhere. And, of course, this agricultural devastation only helped to lengthen the Great Depression, and these effects are being felt worldwide. But 100 million acres of the southern plains were turning into a wasteland called the Dust Bowl. In large sections of 5 states, Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas and Colorado and New Mexico, were affected. In 1932, the National Weather Bureau reported 14 dust storms. 1933, they reported 38. The dust was so thick that people were scooping it up by bucketfuls while cleaning the house. And you would change your child's diaper, and when you take the diaper down, there would be dust in his diaper. You'd put towels and things at the windows to try to keep the dust out, and the wind would blow continuously. Woo, woo. And it was just, suicide rates were up. You would go crazy because you didn't have anything to eat, and every time you looked around, there was dust coming in the house. Sometimes the dust blew so much that your doors were blocked, and to get outside, you had to climb out your windows and then shovel the dust away. Dust covered everything, and people were beginning to give up hope, and we had a mass exodus, the largest migration of Americans in American history, people from the plains. They packed their belongings, they piled them in their cars, and they moved westward, trying to get out of the dust and the desert. And they headed for Washington and Oregon and California, but they were not welcomed. In the fall of 1934, cattle feeds depleted. The government began to buy up and destroy thousands of starving livestock. And of course, of all the government programs at this time, the cattle slaughter was the most heart-wrenching for the farmers. It was difficult for them to give up their herds, but the cattle slaughter really helped many of them avoid bankruptcy because they couldn't feed them. In spring of 1935, the wind blew 27 straight days and nights. People started dying of suffocation and what they called dust pneumonia. The government begins to offer some relief to farmers through the New Deal, and in 1937, they began an aggressive campaign to encourage the people living in the Dust Bowl to adopt planting and plowing methods that could conserve the soil. They even paid reluctant farmers $1 an acre to practice out one of these new methods. So in 1938, the massive conservation effort had reduced the amount of blowing soil by over 65%. But the land still isn't yielding very much. In the fall of 1939, after a decade of dirt and dust, the skies finally opened up and the rain returned. Dry fields again soon yielded their golden wheat once more, and just as quickly as it had begun, the Dust Bowl was over. Thankfully over. And as you can see, these are the 5 states. It's just in that one little area, what they call the Southern Plains. You've got New Mexico, part of Texas Panhandle, Oklahoma Panhandle, western part of Kansas, and eastern part of Colorado. It was bad, and it was so bad that some of the dust would be blown as far away as New York. It was just horrible. Backing up a bit. The Depression, it provoked, shall we say, different responses in different areas of the globe. And for the most of the 1930s, there was conservative governments in Britain and France, and they did very little to resolve their crisis. In Germany, Adolf Hitler of the Nazi Party established one of the most brutal dictatorships in human history. He banned all political opposition. He terrorized Jews. And in the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin launched what he called 5-year plans to industrialize his nation and supposedly eliminated unemployment, but the people who owned land had to give it up to the government. It was a great cost to the people. And in Japan, military government invaded China and tried to take over all of Asia. The United States, we went from Republican to Democratic government, and each one of these leaders, Hitler, Stalin, and Tito in Japan, they had a plan for their country, and Roosevelt had a plan too. It's just we were lucky enough to have a Roosevelt and not have a Hitler. Because Roosevelt envisioned the New Deal as an alternative to socialism and fascism and unregulated capitalism. He wanted to reconcile democracy and individual liberty and economic planning. But when he began his first term, he didn't really have a good plan. He just knew he wanted to do something. But this New Deal is going to change the meaning of freedom for us Americans. Because for decades, we had screamed to keep the government out of our lives, and now we're begging the government to come in and help us. And we welcome them with open arms. And now, he had some good people working for him. Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins, who happened to be the first woman to ever hold a cabinet position. She'd worked at the Hull House in Chicago and been a member of the New York Consumers League. He had some good people. And they all represented, they were results of the progressive era. But they had no unified position. And he also had what we call a brain trust, which is a great deal like that Wisconsin plan. A group of academics that, from Columbia University, professors giving him advice. But let's take a look at the New Deal programs, or as we call it, the alphabet soup of programs. This is part of the first New Deal. And of course, his first order of business was to close all the banks. Bank holiday. Yeah, now, when you go to the bank these days, you see that FDIC out there, and I bet none of you had an idea that it's a system started during the Depression to protect the depositors. And what is it? It's basically an insurance program to protect investors from what happened during the Depression. So now when a bank fails, the investors don't lose anything. Of course, at that time it did. And they had a guarantee of up to $5,000. I think it's up to about $250,000 now. But the FDIC protects you. And of course, I never have $250,000 in the bank at one time because I just don't want to use my grocery money. The TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. And of course, being in Kentucky, we've heard about this for years. The TVA was a bill that was passed within, I guess about 2 months after FDR took his office. It built 21 dams used the Tennessee River, and it encompassed 40,000 square miles. Now, he didn't do it because he thought we needed more dams. He wanted to break the monopoly of the private electric companies. He wanted to provide flood control and soil conservation and reforestation, a diversification of industry and general improvements. And he wanted to generate electricity cheaply for the tens of thousands of rural people who didn't have it. Was it successful? Yes, it's still in use. And I know that my mother-in-law in Kansas, she only lived 5 miles outside of town, but at the time they had private electric companies, and it wasn't beneficial or financially rewarding for them to run a line out to her, so she didn't have electricity until the late 1950s. The REA, the Rural Electrification Administration, that came about because of the TVA, and it's a place that controlled the electricity and where you went to pay your bills. And since we grew up on a farm, I thought everybody went down to the REA to pay their bills. I didn't know what this city thing in town was. Farm Credit Administration, have I got that? No. Soil Conservation Service. It was a good program, and it did help the farmers to learn how to stop erosion and plant properly. And I think the not Western Kentucky, but UK, University of Kentucky, has a lot, they do an awful lot of work on that now. It taught them to stop stripping the topsoils and leveling down all the trees. The Farm Credit Administration. Now, it allowed low-interest loans to prevent farm foreclosures, but you still had to pay them back. They weren't giving you something, it was just helping you. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA. They tried to revive industry. Very controversial. They wanted to help raise prices, but the supply had to be reduced. So I'm a government man, and I come out to you on your farm and I say, You know, it's only normal. You didn't make enough money to do what you needed to do last year, so this year you're going to plant more corn. And I tell you, no, you can't plant more, you got to plant less. And I'm going, you're crazy, because I've got to have money to get shoes for the kids and food for the wife. And I say, no, you can't plant. And I say, I'll tell you what I'll do, I'll pay you not to plant. I thought, wow, that sounds like a good idea. Don't have to plant, and you're going to pay me what I would have gotten anyway? Yeah, we'll do that. Okay. But what if I've already got my crop in the ground and it's ready to harvest? I say, plow it under. Plow it under. Oh, that one caused a lot of concern when the newspapers got a hold of that. We got people standing in bread lines and soup lines in the big cities, and you're plowing corn and stuff under. But it worked, because when you reduce the supply, the prices go up. I think we still have some of that going on today. Did this program help? Yes, it did. It helped the farmer. But did it help the tenant farmer? Did it help the migrant worker? No, because I've got a farm and you're paying me not to plant. I don't need to hire anybody to help me not plant. So it helped me, but there were other people who got hurt. The National Recovery Act, the NRA, and now it's not National Rifle Association. It tried to improve industry through planning. Well, the idea sounded good on paper. They're going to end competition. They're going to end overproduction. They're going to end all the labor conflicts, and they're going to set minimum wages. They tried to stabilize the economy, but all it did was cause endless squabbling among the people who were on the board, and nothing got done. Well, they did get child labor laws established, and they did get a minimum wage set, but that was it, because the wages that they were getting, the minimum wages, were below what was needed to live on. It was a good idea on paper, but it didn't work. PWA, Public Works Administration. Now, that's what we call a pump primer. And if you don't know what a pump primer is, I don't know if you have any grandparents who lived on farms and they've got this old iron pump out there in the yard, and you can go out there and you can just raise that handle up and down, up and down, and up and down, and nothing happens. But you pour a glass of water down the pump shaft, and you pump the handle, and all of a sudden you got water. You primed the pump. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to put some money into the economy to get people to spend. It provided people with jobs, so if you got a job and you got money, you're going to spend it. The government spent almost $6 billion building dams and sewer systems and helping out. It was a good idea. The CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. And if any of you have ever been out to the Cracker Barrel down there on Gretica, they have some pictures of young men standing in front of a barracks type thing that bare from their waist up, and they look so healthy, and that's basically what it was. They hired young men, over 300,000 of them, between 18 and 25. They worked on our nation's parks, they planted trees, they built fire towers, because, back then we didn't have technology, so you had a tower out in the forest with a forest ranger at the top of it with a pair of binoculars, looking for Smokey the Bear, and they restocked our streams. That reminds me of a story. Many, many years ago, I was working for the state of Wyoming, and they put me in the a department where I had no business being, and we did an inventory of all the walleye fish in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and all the surrounding counties. We had to count every damn fish. That was terrible. Anyway, they restocked streams. And it sounds healthy. You're making money. You're working out in the air. You get fed. You got a place to live. And part of your salary is sent home to your family. So it sounds like a good deal. But no women. No African Americans. But it was a good idea. And we did get a lot of stuff done. And there's a picture of them working in the Yosemite National Park back in 1935. All young men. Walking and healthy. The CWA, the Civil Works Administration, good program. 4 million men worked, and they built 40,000 schools, 3,700 playgrounds, 250,000 miles of road. Good plan, but it only lasted 1 year. Because President Roosevelt and his secretary, the leader of the plan, they didn't want to create a permanent class of people dependent on the government for jobs, and it was very expensive. And we're starting to worry about running into a deficit. So it only lasted 1 year, but during that 1 year, it employed 4 million people. The WPA, Works Progress Administration. It employed 3.5 million workers. But even though we paid them, we didn't pay on union scale because the last thing we wanted to do was get in trouble with the union. That's using your noodle. And during the 5 years it operated, it built 2,500 hospitals, 5,900 schools, 1,000 airports, plus 13,000 playgrounds. And by the time it ended, more than $11 billion the government had spent and pumped into the economy. And men had jobs. But this program also had some unusual features. It hired people to catalog and to photograph and to paint and record our history and interview former slaves. There was a program for writers. There was oral histories. The books were written based on the findings, and there was music written. We've had theater projects and art projects. It gave work to creative people, thousands of them. And it also set the precedent of the federal government helping in the arts and humanities. And it was the first time this had ever happened. And this is the project that Zora Hurston was allowed to use to keep on doing her writing. The Wagner Act. And because of it, the National Labor Relations Board was formed. This guaranteed the right of employees to form unions and to arbitrate. The Committee of Industrial Organization was formed. That's the CIO. Now, the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, was a union of skilled workers. But the CIO becomes the organization of unions for unskilled mass production work, such as auto industry, glass, radio, etc. Social Security Act, 1935. The main purpose when it was set up was to help alleviate the America's poor and the children, the elderly and the handicapped. It offered older workers a monthly allotment based on their previous earning, and it provided assistance to the blind. It also established the nation's first unemployment insurance. And of course, some of the critics said, you're putting us on the road to socialism. But it left large amounts of people uncovered. Your migrant workers, your civil servants, your merchant seamen, your day laborers, they weren't covered. It also did not provide any health insurance. That didn't happen until the 1960s under President Johnson. The National Youth Administration, the NYA. It was an organization that actually employed African American youths, and there was even a black educator on their board. The IECP, the Indian Emergency Conservation Program. Now, this program employed 85,000 American Indians. It provided funds for the natives to buy land and to even try to roll back the policies of some of that Dawes plan where we were trying to forcibly integrate them into the white society. The second New Deal was where the Social Security and stuff came in. But FDR kept Congress in session in 1935 to pass the Social Security Act, the Wagner Act, and some more banking reform and utility regulations and taxes. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt, she was a good woman, a good lady. She had a very strange, high-pitched voice, but she and FDR, they worked well together. Like I said, she was his legs. She went out, and she wasn't one of these president's wives that sat in the White House and poured tea. She actually worked. And she also pushed for increasing women and minorities in the government. And partially because of her pushing, FDR appointed what they call a black cabinet of educated African Americans to try to help him with race relations. But meanwhile, the Supreme Court's overturning his programs. He says they're unconstitutional. And FDR comes up with this great court packing plan. So for every Chief Justice or every Justice at the age of 70, we're going to offer them a generous pension to retire. And I'm also going to double the number of judges, and I'm just going to appoint people that will go along with my plans. Bad plan. Bad plan. FDR thought it was necessary, but it caused an uproar like you would not believe. He was trying to usurp power. He was trying to get rid of one of the third branches of government. But by 1938, the New Deal was about over. Well, why was it not more successful? Well, number one, the government is getting tired of all these expenditures, and they don't want this huge federal budget. They didn't want to be the nation's employer either. And in reality, most of the plans were not really well thought out. They were just kind of on the run and on the go. The 1938 elections, the Democrats lose seats in the Senate and the House. They still have a majority. But now we've got a lot of Southern conservative Democrats, and the Republicans are gaining leverage. So I guess you'd say the New Deal is ending in stalemate because these two groups, they think we've spent enough money. We're going into socialism. And Roosevelt began to turn his attention towards Europe and what he knows is coming. But he can't say too much because we are still in that old deadlock. We got tricked into going to World War I, and we're in a depression. There's no way we want to hear about helping anybody else. We need help here. Help me, help me. Never mind the English and the French. Just help me. But during this time, in the 1930s, popular culture followed what we call contradictory paths, because you've got folk culture and traditionals. They're embraced, but you're also welcoming some new modern ideas. And we see for the first time Superman and Batman in comic books. On the radio, you've got the Lone Ranger, Hi-Ho Silver, and who knows, the Shadow knows. Martha Graham's got new dances. And in literature, we've got some good literature. William Faulkner's writing. And of course, you can't forget those beautiful movies with the air conditioning. That fantasy world, it helps us to have faith and actually go in there and be cool and forget our problems for a few minutes. Now, this incident is not in your text, but I want to tell you about something that took place in the early 30s in Alabama. I mentioned to you several times about us being a racist country, but in the Deep South, it was really bad. And I have the YouTube for you to see an example of justice denied called the Scottsboro Boys. I think you're going to be very surprised when you see it. Next lesson, we're going to start with good neighbors and hostile forces. And even though it's in this chapter, it's the last 2 pages, but it's a background for World War II. And I want to cover the background and the war all in one fell swoop. So that being said, thank you for listening.